I couldn't be more thrilled to bring on Joseph Kerski. Back in the 1900s, I met this young guy at the USGS in Denver, at our USGS Geospatial Odyssey uh, thing. Do you still have your pocket protector, Joseph?
I
Anyway,
do.
yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and we used to get together all the GIS people, which was quite a family of people actually. All of us that we kind of all were got started at the same time in the back in those days. And we met this young guy Joseph, who was very had infectious enthusiasm and was a great evangelist for USGS programs and for geospatial data in general. And it was just a thrill to meet this guy because you talked to him for 5 minutes and you were fired up. And I couldn't be more pleased to invite him to join us today. And a longtime friend and really a leader and inspirer of people, all people doing geography and GIS. So Joseph is a geographer. He's an educator and is a GIS professional who's served in the federal sphere with NOAA and USGS and the U.S. Census Bureau. He's in the private, of course, with Esri, where he works in education there. Academic, he teaches at the University of Denver, and he's taught at Santa Gleska University and all over the place. And he's a sought after educator everywhere. And nonprofit sectors as president of the National Council for Geographic Education Sectors. And let's see, he's authored 8 books, 5,000 videos. So check out his YouTube channel and his blog. 175 articles and 1,000 lessons. You can see a lot of his stuff on learn.arcgis.com and on his blog. He's very passionate about GIS education and understanding our world better. So, Joseph, I just couldn't be more pleased. Glad to have you with us today.
I know this is a pretty deep thought for a morning, but what do you want to see in society, folks? And then think about, and let's chew on for a bit, how should education be structured to meet these societal goals? All of the issues that confront us in South Dakota, Colorado here behind me, my homeland, Western Colorado, just a bit southwest of you all, but they all have challenges that are spatial in nature, right? We could go on about what those challenges are. If we had a room full of face-to-face folks like we've had in the past, and by the way, I was with you all, or with many of you in Mitchell 2 years ago. I had a grand time there with you. But if we were face-to-face, we'd have this discussion about, okay, natural hazards, health, supply chain, racial and social inequities, energy, water, climate. All of these are complex issues that increasingly affect our everyday lives, and they're spatial in nature. And hence, geospatial sciences and the spatial perspective through the application of GIS can help us to solve those, understand and then solve those issues. And why do I say and? Because oftentimes, and as my colleagues very graciously mentioned my interest and passion for all things education, people will send me their URLs. Hey, Joseph, I've got my data on the map. Check it out. Great, I'll say. And? Why do I say and? Because it's not enough just to have the data on the map. Now, I know many of you listening to this, watching this right now, your task is to map your data. But there's a bigger goal always. There's a higher, more noble goal, if you will, for doing the work, the good work that you folks are doing. And that is so that you and your colleagues in decision-making roles can understand land use, transportation, water, etc., in a deeper, richer way so that we can build this more resilient, healthier, more equitable future that we're all seeking, correct? So that's why I say, and I remind you all, that the goal is not to learn more GIS or to get your data onto a map, right? We got to think about those higher goals always. It's really a high calling that we're all in, and I salute you all for the good work that you're doing. I truly mean that. I think you are the people building this more resilient future. If we don't do it, who's going to do it? We have to lead. And that's one of the reasons why I love the geospatial community. And for those of you that are new or you have influence, I know many of you teach community colleges, technical colleges, tribal colleges, universities, K-12. You have, or you've got your own kids, you have direct influence in these future leaders, these future change agents. That's what we're trying to build in education, change agents. It's not just learning more useful technological skills, right? It's that higher, more noble goal. Now, you all know as well as I do that education is one of those big societal structures that has undergone massive amounts of change. And one could argue, I think, quite easily, that the seeds for change in education go long before COVID. Higher education, primary and secondary education, community and technical tribal colleges, they have always been, let's think about how we can restructure and reinvent ourselves continually so we will be relevant at the end of this decade like we are now, or even in a more relevant sense. So certainly, though, COVID has hastened much of that restructuring. Many university and other higher education professionals, and almost all K-12 education professionals that I've been working with, came to March 2020 saying, I have to teach online now. I've never taught online before. At the higher education level, many of them had taught online, but many had not. And can you imagine this all happening in the days of desktop-only GIS? I've got to teach online, and I've got to teach a complex, changing, rapidly evolving platform that GIS is. How do I do that? I would argue that if this had happened just a few years ago, we probably would not have been able to carry on in terms of meaningful GIS education. Now, I know many of you have traveled extensively, and I've traveled extensively as well around the world. Those are some of my most treasured career experiences, and I have met lots of students and faculty that have a very rich and deep knowledge of GIS. They actually, at their university, did not have an actual lab. And so they are very well grounded in the theory and the concepts of geospatial sciences, but they'd never actually practiced it. Okay, March 2020 rolls around, we have massive amounts of restructuring. Fortunately, if it had to happen, I wish it hadn't taken a crisis, but many people said, you know, those web capabilities, those web tools, and I am teaching a workshop later on about connecting story maps, dashboards, web maps, and a survey, a field survey, through this web GIS platform that we all now have capabilities in and access to. As an example, feel free to attend that. But having those tools and the GIS as a platform really enabled people to not only pivot, but be successful with it. And now, 18 months later, they are saying many of the workshops, courses I can actually use, or in my place of work, I can actually use these web tools. Is desktop connected to web still relevant? Well, absolutely. And Kenneth gave us lots of examples yesterday about how to effectively use, for example, ArcGIS Pro. As you know, it's an installed program, but it's connected to the cloud, just like other tools that you use. Another thing that I wanted to mention right here at the beginning is that education is going to continue. It's going to be hybrid, online, face-to-face, some combination of those going forward. But also geotechnologies is going to continue. Some of you may remember, and Curtis hinted at this, that he and I go way back to the 1900s. I like the way you said that, Curtis, with geospatial technology. It has not only achieved many of the things we dreamed about. Wouldn't it be great if we had a library of content that we can just stream in and we wouldn't have to deal with physical media of various kinds, discs and so on? Wouldn't that be great? And wouldn't it be great if we could sort of do this projection on the fly? Okay, many of those things, those hopes and dreams that we had have come true. There are still things, and I'm sure you folks can identify, that are still agonizingly clunky in a geospatial software set, no matter which one you're using. They're just, you think to yourself, why is this still so hard? So we're not quite where we want to be, but fortunately, we have made great strides as a community. There were some articles 20 years ago that said geospatial technology is not going to be a thing by 2020 because it's going to be so embedded in mainstream IT and workflows in an organization that it won't be a separate sort of entity. One could argue that in part that has come true. GIS, as you folks well know, is, let's say you're in a county government, it is in Parks and Rec, it is in zoning, it is in transportation, it is in water. But it is still a rather special and spatial kind of a community, isn't it? That's why we have these conferences. And indeed, the same articles that stated that 20 years ago said we won't even have GIS conferences. We'll just be in the regular IT conferences. Well, we do have a very interesting and I think a special community, don't we? And I always tell students this, I'm sure many of you do this as well, that the people in the community are what you're going to remember. Years from now, you probably won't even remember that Joseph gave this address on this day in October 2021, but you will remember the people that you've worked with. And I think the geospatial community is a very earth-centric, earth ethic-oriented community, right? We actually do care about soil and water and landforms and climate and weather and so on and so forth. We actually do care about this. It goes deep down. I think almost all of us would find a way to do this even if we weren't getting paid in some ways, correct? We still have to maintain our economic, vitality, provide for our families and so on, right? But we'd find a way to do some of this because it's really a part of us. You think about those mental maps that you have in your head of places, especially as a child, right? Those mental maps have been studied. You can look up articles about that, but they're very large scale, right? You could probably sketch for me and the community listening to this right now, a very detailed map of your own neighborhood as a kid, even if you were one of those kids that moved around a lot, and the vacant lot across the street from the school, and the way to your friend's house, and the way you got to school, and the route you took to the public library, et cetera, right? Very detailed, or the riparian zone. Now, me growing up in Western Colorado, I grew up next to a national monument, the Colorado National Monument. So I spent a lot of time in the canyons and trails of the National Monument, but just ordinary landscapes as well in the Grand Valley. And I'm sure you can identify with that. Place is a very fundamental part of human experience. And one could argue that it's a common thing that we have that we can share and identify with, sort of like music in a sense. And there are some presentations that Jack Dangerman and others have given in the past about maps becoming the sort of common language of the planet. Now, I used to show a video called A World in a Box. Perhaps Curtis and others remember that video from gita.org. The beginning of the video was very contentious. It was about the environmental spotted owl community in Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and the logging community, the people making their living logging trees. And the beginning of the video, again, was very controversial and got students, when I'd show this, taking notice, because it was people throwing themselves in front of logging trucks and people carrying protest signs and so on. Now, 20 minutes into the video, though, when both of those communities got GIS and they got maps that they could all gather around the table, okay, maybe they weren't breaking out singing John Denver songs on the guitar. He was a musician, by the way. But the point is, they were all at least in the same room, not coming to blows. And they also realized that they had one common thing amongst themselves that they all treasured and valued, and that is a healthy forest. So GIS was the beginning of their discussion about how can we work together. And that to me was always one of the best examples of GIS bringing people together around common themes. So geotechnology is going to continue as, okay, more embedded in mainstream IT and workflows and organizations, but also still a distinctly special spatial community. Okay, one of the things that I wanted to do is continue a dialogue with you all far beyond today's workshop and today's address. I hope that you'll be able to take some things from this away that you'll be able to actually use. So I intend for this to be practical, but I want you to think about some forces, trends, and skills in geospatial technology, and also think about what's happening in education and why should I, GIS professional that I am in South Dakota or beyond, care? Why should I care? I oftentimes think of geospatial technology as thinking about what's where, why is it there, and why should we care? Why should we care about climate, energy, and all the other issues that you and I can chat about for the next several hours, which we don't have? But why should we care? That's always at the heart of all this. So that's why I put my contact information here. Feel free to contact me, connect with me on LinkedIn. It would be great to continue our discussion together. Also, I'm sharing this pathway of mine for two reasons. Not one to bore you to tears, but to think about two things. One, that your skills in geospatial technology can be relevant in many sectors of society. I've been rather blessed to be in four major sectors of society in my career: federal, academia, nonprofit, and industry. And so I want you to think about that your geospatial skills, but also this tool here. If you don't think about anything else after this address, think about the most important tool that Joseph was mentioning is this tool right here, my brain. Your brain, your spatially enabled, spatially thinking brain. That is the most important tool, right? The tools, the geospatial tools will evolve, right? They'll continue to become easier, more intuitive, expand in scope, but keep nurturing this tool. That's one of my themes for today. The second reason why I share my own pathway is because I want you to think about that you can change. So in my case, being at those federal agencies for years, I actually did make a fairly major change, but still in geospatial technology, changing from federal agencies to being education manager at Esri. In many ways, it wasn't such a drastic change because my theme was always, how do we get these tools into the hands of people so that they can make smarter and wiser decisions to build this more sustainable future? That's always been my goal. But vastly different organizations in some ways, composed of people, imperfect, but trying to do the right thing, really listening to the community, I think is why those organizations have been successful. Now we're all anchored in space and place. Many of you have been to Denver. You know that it's at the major ecoregion boundary between the high, short grass prairie, Great Plains, and the Rocky Mountain Front Range. And just like South Dakota, it's a place where we want to move to. People want to move there, right? Black Hills, Front Range, lots of recreational activities. I'm on my bicycle, but you can see people on horseback here. We've got that bank cloud in the background. It's always a sign of fair weather here on the Front Range. You get that from October to April for several days straight, where you've got the lee side of the mountains, and that cloud just sits up there, makes for beautiful sunsets, but it's always a sign of fair weather in the winter, dry and fair. So, okay, with that attention and with that influx of people, okay, where are we going to get the water? Where are we going to get the energy to power the economy and to sustain people's livelihoods that are all moving here? Another thing that I wanted to mention here ever so briefly is that this education program that my colleagues and I, we have about a 15-person team, and you probably know of the group that offers Esri training or MOOCs. We work closely with those teams. We are, though, just focused on educators, students, deans, campus facility managers, and others in education. That is our market, if you will. That is our audience. That is our community. So we are, think of us as your industry partner for all things education. And for those students out there listening to this, either live or the recording, I want you to think about a couple of things. One, think about what you're going to do for your organization. Oftentimes we get people, well-meaning folks that apply and say, you know, I want to learn more GIS. So I want to work for Esri or USGS or South Dakota Department of Natural Resources, et cetera. Well, we all want to learn more about the technology. Sure. We're very inquisitive people, right? We're very curious people. More about that in a bit. But think about how you're going to contribute to the organization. That is, unless you're one of those few people, and there are people out there that are independent, maybe some of you are independent consultants and you are your own boss and you have a consultancy. But chances are you're going to be working for an organization. You got to think about the organization's goals. Does the organization that you're going to apply to meet, at least in part, your own personal ethos? So in the case of Esri, it's, and many of our business partners, education, sustainability, and science. And that's been our threefold goal since 1969. For some of you that are new to GIS, this might be of interest. We are actually one of the older software companies. We're older than Microsoft, Google, Apple, and that's been our goal. Another thing that I want you to think about is how you then can contribute to that organization's goals. Okay, now I want you to also think about the following. What kind of geeky things did you do as a kid? Now, in my case, I made maps, probably no surprise to you all. Maybe you can identify with some of the nerdy things that you did that nobody else enjoyed, but that's okay. You did them anyway. Now, for me, I made up places and I had streets and what are these numbers in the margins of my maps? I named all my streets based on names in phone books when I ran out of last names of my friends. They're address ranges. What kid cares about address ranges? What kid knows about address ranges? So I've got the 4200 block north and I got the 3500 north block, and they're 7 blocks apart. So anyway, one of the things I wanted to say is embrace those kinds of things and make them your own. Make them your own path, part of your own pathway. Treasure those things. I truly believe that geotechnologies are essential for learning, as we'll talk about today in the next 4 hours that we have together. Just kidding, we don't have 4 hours. Just want to make sure you folks were on your toes. And essential for the planet. It is absolutely critical that you all continue on and don't get discouraged. You're doing the work that we need to build this more resilient future. Another thing that I wanted to mention here is I wanted to say that everybody has seen the JHU COVID dashboard. There was a time 2 years ago when I used to get these questions. Joseph, why does Esri have a health team? I don't think people ask that anymore. These dashboards, these ArcGIS hub sites, the other things that people have stood up and built, they're not doing that just for eye candy, right? They're doing that because they need to make decisions. They need to make wiser and smarter decisions. Another thing that I wanted to say.
Hey, Joseph, have you been trying to share anything?
Oh, yes, I've got a whole bunch of stuff.
We haven't seen anything but your face.
Bummer. Okay.
I want to see your map.
Yeah. Okay, so
it says something you've been captivating us without any images.
Oh gosh. Okay, so here are my core tenets, my contact information, my pathway, my photograph of the Front Range, some of my geeky photographs that I took as a teenager were always of infrastructure and natural features. They were almost never of people, and a couple of these nerdy maps that I shared. But anyway, thanks for pointing that out. So one of the things I wanted to just get you to chew on today, folks, is these 5 forces. Now, when I lay out these lists today, they're sort of like the 5 places to go in South Dakota before you die, the 5 coolest bands of all time. You know, they're debatable, right? But I would just submit these as 5 to think about. First of all, geo-awareness. Again, everybody has seen with a device, everybody that has a device has seen the JHU COVID dashboard. So the awareness of geotechnologies and people being enabled to use some of these geotechnologies, whether it's to navigate their way across campus or across to their grandmother's house or to the public library or wherever, people are enabled. They're aware of climate, natural hazards, and other issues that we chatted about earlier. And the geotechnologies themselves, it's great that we have music in the cloud, right? Some of you use Apple, Amazon Music, Spotify, Pandora. You have a service. Sure, you may have some on your local device, but you also have music in the cloud. Why? So you can access it anytime, anywhere, any place. Ditto for Dropbox, OneDrive, Google Drive, etc., right? For your documents, because you want to share an article and work on an article or a paper or a set of documentation or something that you're working on for your city, your county, your private company, whatever wherever you're working. I would just submit that geotechnologies in the cloud is even more important than those other things. As cool as it is to have ABBA's greatest hits in the cloud, that was a band, by the way, it's even better to have geotechnologies. Why? Because of a couple reasons. First of all, these problems and issues that I talked about earlier, climate, energy, water, etc., transportation, They don't stop at physical boundaries like the one behind me, that Manco Shale and the Green River Formation, that ridge behind me. They don't stop at watersheds or ridges, right? They transcend physical boundaries. They also transcend political boundaries, right? They're not just your county, your state, your country, my country. They're global to local at all levels and scales. And third, they transcend disciplinary boundaries. They're not just economics or transportation or urban planning or civil engineering or health. They're all those disciplines. And so one of the things that's encouraging to me over these past few years in particular is that we've had a broadening of people interested in geospatial technologies. And indeed, when I was referring to, which of course you didn't see, the page that I was referring to a bit ago, this page, one of the goals of my team is to broaden the interest and use of geospatial technology in multiple disciplines in academia, for example, even at secondary, but especially at the university level. Why? Because we want people to be enabled and empowered to make smarter and wiser decisions in health, in business, and so on. So we've created these landing pages, for example, location analytics in business. Hey, you're teaching supply chain, you're teaching marketing, and it's all about location, location, location. Consider using some aspect of geospatial technology. Maybe not as much as you and I would use, most likely not as much. But start with something like Business Analyst Web. You can make choropleth maps, make drive time and walk times. You can figure out where the competition potentially is in the planned new business that you're citing, or you're routing your vehicles around a metropolitan area or a region in a rural area, et cetera. These are tools that you can actually use to teach your content, and you can also use them to do your own research. So I'll just show you two. Spatial data science. Data science is a emerging program, certificate, degree program, et cetera, in many institutes of higher education. Now, one could argue, and I think rightly so, that geospatial technologies, geospatial science has always been data science, right? We've always been data geeks, haven't we, folks? We've always wanted more data and more diverse array of data, even in the days when it was very clunky to get that data. So we've set up these pages, not just as, nice things to look at, but actually, okay, how do I teach with this? How do I learn with this? So give me some lessons, give me some data, give me some tools that enable me to do that. Give me the messaging behind this so I can talk to my dean or my fellow faculty members. So this is all about broadening the scope of GIS in education. And I would just say that we are just at the beginning of that broad effort. After working with schools of business, for example, for over 2 years, we have a small handful of universities, community colleges, technical tribal colleges that are very keen on using GIS, or as they call it more commonly, location analytics in business. Again, I want things to happen, as you probably do as well, faster than they do oftentimes, but education's a big ship, and to change course, even for this aspect, requires a lot of ongoing relationship building and so on. So it's slow, but it is happening. And I would say business and health informatics programs, not just at JHU, but elsewhere, where they're saying, hey, I want to use these tools as well in my health program. Also in civil engineering, especially with as I'll touch on in a bit, the tools that people now have to teach CAD, BIM, AEC, architectural engineering and construction, building information management, computer-aided drafting and design with GIS. That's sort of blurring of the lines between those two communities, the people that map the interior spaces and the people that map the exterior spaces. Because they have tools now enabling to do both, that is starting to happen as well. Also in mathematics, digital humanities, and history. Besides the core where GIS started, as probably many of you, like me, started in geography, environmental science, or planning. So it is starting to spread. The other goal that I have and I hold near and dear is deepening the notion of GIS, that GIS is not to teach and learn software X version Y. It's about field tools and communication tools, right? With dashboards and story maps and the blurring of the lines between maps and visualizations. Spatial analytics, working with a wide variety of data types, and so on. So the whole deeper notion, and coding, Jupyter notebooks and other things that enable people to actually get some hands-on practice with some of these things. What powers all of these web maps that people are seeing? JavaScript, Python, etc. So the deepening and the broadening is the two-part goal of my colleagues and I. But we can't do it alone. We have 15 people on the team. So we are working very closely with great communities like yours to nudge that needle forward in education and then by extension in greater society. What's happening at the K-12 level? Let's talk about that for a moment. Here is a rather geeky map with these little red schoolhouses indicating which schools have ArcGIS Online. I know that's a proxy for which schools are actually doing GIS or using GIS in their instruction. But still, it's encouraging because you can see that, hey, there are schools, not, and this is just the USA map, obviously, all around the world where they're empowered to teach a content area. Very seldom, I'd say about 5% of these schools actually have a GIS course. I would argue, you probably would as well, that in the 1990s and 1980s even, when there were a plethora of CAD labs in many secondary schools, that GIS is every bit as important, if not more so, than teaching CAD. So why not have a GIS course? And indeed, like I say, in about 5% of secondary schools, or even some middle schools, lower secondary, there's an actual GIS course or advanced geography or something where their GIS is actually the focus. But more commonly, in 95% of the schools, it is GIS in a content area. So I'm going to use GIS to teach history or to teach math or to teach AP Human Geography or to teach Earth Science. So they can use things like the Living Atlas of the World or the mapping apps that come from Living Atlas, the Water Balance app. Hey, I want to teach about water balances around the world, and I'm going to use the Water Balance app to teach about precipitation, evapotranspiration. So wherever I click, it's tied to the Internet of Things, I'm going to get a graph showing me changes over time. And if I click in South America at the Amazon, hey, it's not summer and winter, it's a wet season and a dry season. And I can teach that concept by having my students use as well those apps. The Wayback Swipe imagery that probably many of you have seen, that's great for teaching about change over space and time. So we have a dynamic planet. It makes sense to use dynamic tools like this. Nothing against textbooks. I've written some myself. But you're not confined, and our message to educators is you're not confined to this map on page 300 of your textbook that shows ocean currents. You've got the ocean currents in the Living Atlas of the World, and you can interact with that and find out what the warm currents are and the cold currents and what climate regimes that are they affecting on land and so on. So you've got this rich body of content. So most of the time in secondary and primary schools, teachers are using geospatial technology to teach a core content area. And as many of you know, because you have kids or you've worked in education, it's all anchored in the content standards as well, the state and the national content standards. No matter what country you're working in, you've got to anchor it. You've got to show that this is aligned to the content standards. Otherwise, most schools say, I can't do that because I have to teach this content according to these standards. And so our message is GIS is not something in addition to your already disrupted lives that we want you to think about using. It's, hey, I'm going to teach about the Dust Bowl. I'm going to teach about ocean currents. I'm going to teach about history, historic battlefields, etc. And I'm going to use geospatial to engage the students, to have them do inquiry. In other words, investigate, ask questions, and dig into real data, and anchored in what's called problem-based learning. So those are the key messages, especially in primary and secondary. And as you can see, we're making progress. The number of little red schoolhouses on this map is about 8,500. Now, there are 110,000 total primary and secondary public and private schools in the USA alone. So we're not even at 10%, but it's gone on an order of magnitude. So when we had desktop only GIS, we'd have these teacher institutes. They'd get done with the institute. Oh yeah, Joseph, I've got to install software and I've got to work with my IT staff. And there were some, according to the Rogers diffusion of innovations curve, there were some early adopters, what Rogers calls the early adopters and innovators, that did it. They said, this is so engaging. I'm going to spend nights and weekends figuring out how to do this in school, with my class, with my whole school. But now with the web, hey, I don't have to install anything. I can use ArcGIS Online, Living Atlas of the World. I can have students make maps. I can have them go out in the field and collect tree species or litter or the number of pedestrians at intersections in their community or public art or historical homes or whatever. And I can also do that remotely. I can teach that in an online setting. So that has nudged the number from 850 to 8,500. So we've still got a long way to go, but we're making progress. Again, working closely in conjunction with good folks like you. Citizen science has lent a big boost to this as well, because you think about the citizen science movement going back to the birding community and the birth of the Audubon Society in the 1860s, 1870s-ish era. And now people collecting data on pine beetle infestation or birds or weather or water quality or whatever, and being able to map it with tools like Survey 123. And then I get a map out of that, and then I can do analysis on that. Remember, the goal is not just to put the data on the map. So that's helped education, but it's also a bigger force in GIS, as many of you know. And finally, storytelling. This whole presentation is a story map, right, that I'm giving. This whole thing that I've been chatting about with you all for the last 30 minutes-ish. It's a story map. Why? Because I have some embedded maps in it. I still use Prezi. I still use PowerPoint. I still use other communication tools. As Curtis mentioned, I've got 5,000 videos on the Our Earth channel, including many in South Dakota. So I still use those tools, but story maps are a great way of communicating changes, patterns, relationships, possible trends. So I just submit that these are 5 forces that bring us to this really key pivotal time, and I'm so thankful that you folks are in this at this time in history. This is a great time for you to be in GIS. And for those of you that are sort of thinking about how can I expand this in the future with my own pathway, this is a good time to do that. We have never before been confronted with so many issues of concern, right? From our own communities to the globe. And so we desperately need your skills and abilities. So those are some of the forces that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about some trends also. Again, this is my own list. You don't have to agree with this. And in fact, you probably have things that you say, hey, Joseph, you're forgetting this one, or you're forgetting that one. I'm going to put the link to the story map here. But 3D, it makes sense that we have 3D GIS. We've had 3D analysis for just a few years, but we had 3D visualization for quite a few years before that. But it makes sense that we have 3D analysis tools because we live in a 3D world. It doesn't necessarily mean terrain, like the terrain behind me, right? It could be your population data. It could be visualizing your water quality, dissolved oxygen, your dissolved solids, your pH in a 3D way. Don't just do it because the 3D tools exist, but if it helps you understand that variable or that phenomenon better, deeper, in a more rich way, do it. Also, I touched on this a bit ago, the notion of having the blurring of the lines between the people mapping interior spaces and the people mapping exterior spaces, I think is really critical going forward. One example could be, okay, you're developing a resiliency plan for your community. You've got to have the interior spaces, let's say all your public buildings mapped, and your exterior spaces mapped between those public buildings, or a university campus or a community college campus for that matter. Okay. Where are the emergency exits? Where are the shelters? If a weather event roars through there at 3 p.m. on a Friday, where are the students? Where are the employees? Where are the faculty, et cetera? We have to have those interior and exterior spaces mapped as part of that plan. We can't have these communities separate anymore. One could argue that we never really should have had those separate, but the evolution of these tools kind of developed with these 2 separate communities. The Internet of Things, big data, real-time data and analytics. We want to map things, and we want to map them now, don't we, folks? We want to map and understand the condition of the stream gauges down the street from my community or my campus. We want to know what the real-time wildfire perimeters are, etc., as near real-time as possible. And again, the web GIS platform is helping us enable that. Enterprise and web GIS. In the past, it was more, you want to see those people down the hall and to the right if you want some GIS data or maps. They're a little geeky, but they're nice people. Go talk to them, right? That's where the front desk folks in a organization would direct you in the past. There's still some of that, certainly. GIS is used by certain people in an organization in a deep way, but I would argue that top of the sort of a pyramid, if you will, more people in an organization are using at least some GIS than ever before. So the whole notion of GIS being an enterprise valued entity or commodity that a government agency or a private company or a nonprofit or a university, a community technical tribal college would value throughout their organization is starting to take hold. And that has implications for the broadening of the community. Not everyone, for example, pointing to the example that I talked about earlier, in a school of business would need to know about every single thing that you and I like to know about in geospatial technology. They want to be able to map their customers, map consumer behavior, map demographics, do drive times, routing. But on the other hand, I always try to nudge them forward. Hey, if you're doing some sort of study in your business on polar opening up of some polar shipping routes, I want you to know about map projections. I don't want you to use a standard default map projection. I want you to use a polar projection. And so why does that matter? That type of thing. So artificial intelligence and machine learning, think about this video that I filmed up in, this was actually at South Dakota State. I was there on campus. And think of every single tree, condition of the pavement, sign, building facade, condition of the sidewalks being automatically captured through a standard video like this. That has vast implications for a lot of things, not the least of which is going to change the jobs that many people in GIS have, right? No longer just gathering the data. It's going to be there through these automated methods. Do we need to care about data quality? Well, absolutely. So a lot of it is checking the data that's being gathered in a large volume, but still it's going to have implications for the kinds of skills and tasks that GIS analysts have. And also I think it has implications for the following, that more and more people have job positions where GIS is one of the things on their tool belt, correct? They're not going to be necessarily GIS technician, GIS manager. I'm trying to think of any time in the past 30 years that I've ever had GIS in my title. I've never had that. Maybe some of you can relate. I've been education manager, cartographer, geographer. I've never had GIS in my title. It's always been important to my roles. But another key trend is I'm going to be able to gather data even underground. So we've got a business partner, Argis Solutions, augmented reality solutions. So they've got this tool where, again, data quality being important, what is the resolution of the pipelines or the cable lines or something like that that's underground that I'm just walking around on the surface with my smartphone, in this case, looking at. But if this has the potential to save communities energy, time, money by digging up and figuring out where things are or relying on maybe some old drawings, being able to do this kind of thing has just one of many implications for all of our future. So I would just submit that these are some of the key trends that we need to pay attention to going forward. Again, you might have a slightly different list, and I'd just love to hear from you all as we go forward. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is as follows. Think about this. Given that I've said geospatial is becoming broader and deeper in many aspects of our society, including education and many other structures, government, nonprofit, et cetera, beyond, I think you still need to have your elevator speech, because your CEO, your board of directors, your city manager, your university provost, someone will come down the hall or email you or send you a Teams notice. Hey, you need to have your 5-minute speech. You need to go talk to these folks because they're going to wonder. I've got Google Maps on my phone. Why do I need you? Or what is your plan going forward on X topic? So I still think you need that. And I have on my Our Earth video channel actually examples of me in real elevators giving examples of elevator speeches. You don't need to use my template, but just for ideas going forward. I think you still need that, despite remember the forces that I talked about earlier, geo-awareness being one of them. I don't think people always translate necessarily in 2021. I'm hoping this will change with all of our nudgings. I think it will, but they're still not connecting the concern of, hey, climate, natural hazards, et cetera. These are all of concern, water availability, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? All of those issues are global, but they increasingly affect our everyday lives. They don't always connect it to the need for geospatial training and education and people in that industry. So I still think you need this. Along those lines, I still have a traditional kind of resume or CV, but I also have a story map. I encourage all of you, even if you're not actively seeking a different position, to create a story map of your CV. This one here, normalize your core path. Guess where I got that button from? Kenneth Field. Yep. Anyway, have a story map of your CV for a couple reasons. Number one, you can put in your own personal philosophy in a sort of an engaging way. Number two, it's fun. It's a nice way for you to get experience. My right hand is pointing on where I am right now, Denver, Metro Denver. I love big maps. I cannot lie. And number three, so you can be immersed in the story maps tools, and every so often when you update yours, you can use some of the new capabilities just for fun to try them out in the story maps set of tools at your fingertips. But number four, I also encourage you to have at least one embedded web map in there, okay? Why? Because oftentimes we get story maps that are just text and photos and videos. That's okay. We don't come down on those people, but the whole idea of having a story map is to have at least one map that you can interact with. So I encourage you to do that. And you can put, like me, you can put where you went to school, the internships, the different career pathways, the experiences that you've had. And I think probably the most important reason of all is because, here's my favorite globe. The Flushing Meadows Globe in New York City. That is the world's heaviest globe, 1964 World's Fair globe. What's your favorite globe? Number four, I think, five, the most important reason here is that not everybody does this. And so if you are at some point thinking about like adding to your existing job duties or taking a different, or job in an organization, not everybody does this. And so I think it helps nudge your own application to maybe the short list or the short digital stack of files that your potential future employer would look at. So I think there's several compelling reasons to do this. And I have a essay on the Esri community space. It's our own education blog for those of you that really care about education and you want to get more involved, or you got kids in school or whatever other reason you have. This is a nice place to go for every few days. My colleagues and I post something here, and one of mine was how to do this, why to do this, why to create a story map of your CV or resume. Another thing that I thought was pertinent here is the evolution of this platform is very powerful in the sense of connecting things together. Now, I'll explain more about this in my upcoming workshop today, but here's an example of that very thing. These tools are powerful on their own, but when you connect them together, I think it adds a lot of value. Now, you and I have tools that we use all the time that are probably unconnected to anything else. You have apps on your phone that do one or two things, they do them well, and they're not connected to anything else, and you're okay with that. You have tools on your computer that you use as well. I have a photo editing tool that was authored by a computer science person in Germany that I've used for over 20 years. It's like 4 megabytes in size. It does my photo editing for me. Doesn't do everything that Photoshop does, et cetera, or Adobe Illustrator, but it does them and does them well. It's not connected to anything else. But in the sense of this ArcGIS, for example, as one example, and I know there are others of this GIS platform that we're talking about, here's my example on connecting 4 different things together. And this one, many of you probably recognize this. Here's walkability with a photo of Mitchell, South Dakota that I took 2 years ago when I was with you all. All y'all, as they say in Texas. Ustedes, vous, tú, you all. Is this walkable or not? I would place it toward the more walkable than less walkable. There's a few cars. There's not really any traffic. There's some ramps. The pavement's in pretty good condition. And you can see the Corn Palace in the background. So here's my story map. Why is walkability important to communities? Why do communities care about it, et cetera? Inside my story map, I have a survey 123. So Survey 123 is one of those tools like iNaturalist and others that you can crowdsource. So anybody can collect data into my walkability survey, including you all. Right now, I have it open, and until I, the author, close it, it's now open for anybody to take these 5 questions. Is it friendly or unfriendly? How would you rate it from terrible to excellent? Is it walkable in terms of there's wide path or sidewalk? Is there some branches? No. Where is it, germane to our discussion today? And then do you have a photograph of it? So inside my walkability map, I have the results fed from the Survey 123. Now, you've all seen the JHU COVID dashboards we talked about a moment ago. That gets feeds from local governments, WHO, CDC, and other organizations. So it's got a lot of feeds coming in. My web map has feeds from my one survey, and that's all. So it's a very simple kind of a map, but it gets feeds in real time from my survey of the characteristics that I and other people that have submitted data into it have contributed to. So in this case, hey, here are my companions on this particular walk. Good on you, mates. She'll be right. So here's me walking around in Canberra before I had to go to work that day. These tails on these kangaroos, they're like this. They're like those pool noodles, that are in bright colors, pink and orange and yellow. They're like this thick. They were very curious, and that was a great walk. But I'm very passionate about walkability. What are you passionate about? What do you care about? What could you do with these tools, for example? So at the end of my story map, I have a dashboard. Again, just like the JHU dashboard, or maybe some dashboards that you all have created. In my case, the dashboard is very simple. It's got a couple of pie charts in here, roughly 3/4 of the crowdsourced story map enabled Survey 123 embedded survey responses that have come back have said this is walkable rather than pedestrian unfriendly. I have 536 points in my survey as of this moment, and you can see a couple of other things that I put in here, a legend and an image and so on. So one of the things that I wanted to share was that this whole thing is connected, right? There's the survey, the story map, the dashboard, and the web map. They're all connected. They're all part of this platform. The second thing I wanted to point out here is that this took me literally 4 class periods. I'm talking in education speak, I know. 4 hours to create. So we're not talking days, weeks, months. There are certain things in geospatial technology that take a long time to learn, admittedly. But I think one of the encouraging things about the evolution of the tools and the data sets via these open data platforms, hub sites and other ways to deploy the data, many of you are standing up those kinds of things, is that it is many of the things in geospatial are much more approachable than they were even a few years ago or even last year. So that is good. That is a way for you to draw additional colleagues into geospatial. So this is one example of ease of use, ease of creation, but also connecting different elements of the platform. And for more about how I actually did that, well, we'll hang out in a workshop later on today on that. All right, so a couple of comments in closing here. One of which is I do have, as you can see here, a lot of stuff about the job market in geospatial from the World Economic Forum and other sources. So I'm skipping over 60% of this story map because I wanted to have it chock full for you to explore more. So you can be emailing me on Saturday night. Hey, Joseph, I'm looking at your story map and there's this in the middle section that you've skipped over, but this is really interesting. So I'd love to have you dig into this a little bit deeper. But for the last few moments that we have together, I would just, again, another list that I would submit as something to think about. that I believe are the top 5 skills for all of us to keep nurturing. Remember, it's all about this tool, your brain, your spatially thinking brain. GIS has always been a thinker's tool. That's what's intriguing about it, right? It helps us to frame problems. And so therefore, my first of the top 5 skills, which I truly believe is the most important, is to be curious. For those of you that are new in the profession, ask questions that your professor is not even asking you. Ask questions that your work space, your workplace supervisor is not even asking you. That's the kind of employees that we at Esri and others value, right? That people can go deeper and think about the workflow of the culture of an organization. Why are we doing it this way? Let's brainstorm. So asking questions and being curious. We've all experienced the final.aprx, final2.aprx, really final.aprx or MXD. Why? Because we're very tenacious, right? So being curious leads to tenacity, whether it's software or grappling with a problem or coming up with solutions or communicating the results of that. That's another thing I love about GIS. It's one of those whole problem kind of tools or platforms. You can frame a question in it. You can analyze, you can gather data, you can communicate about it. And that should lead to additional questions, right? It's the geographic inquiry cycle, which is related to the scientific inquiry cycle. It asks you, my friend Charlie Fry, cartographer here at Esri, always says a good map teaches you to ask a better question. A good map teaches you to ask a better question. I love that. Being able to work with data and being critical of it is critical, I think, going forward. Now, to that end, for example, I've got, hey, you've all got this. I've got this popular demographics from the American Community Survey, and I can say, well, you know what? I don't want that variable. I can say, ooh, average home value. Where did the data come from? Who created it? How often is it updated? Can I trust it in my application, for example? So, gosh, I can map different variables with this set of tools. Fascinating to be able to do that, and at multiple scales, right, folks? So the idea is here I've got I know this sounds super boring, Joseph's data blog, or can't stand my excitement, but this is, I think, centered on 3 different things that you might find of value. Spatial reserves. Where can I find data? How do I know if it's any good? Is it suitable for my project? Can I trust it? What about metadata standards and so on? And then third, societal issues around that data. And I've structured each one of these essays that comes out every 2 weeks. It originally came out through this book that a colleague and I wrote for Esri Press called The GIS Guide to Public Domain Data, which again, admittedly sounds a bit dry, doesn't it? But these issues are so important to us all. And what I've tried to do in here is, okay, what's the value of location data? That's one of the recent posts in here. Here's again, short essays that you could use as arguments or discussion points with your colleagues, with your supervisors, etc. But I've also tried to put in examples about societal issues like location privacy. Hey, I have a fitness app. Do I share that with the world? All my walks and runs and cycle rides? No, but if I did, would it matter? Those kinds of things. And I also have some fun ones in here that you can use even with family members as to why this actually matters. So here's one that I posted a week ago. Interesting. See, this is from obviously a food store. You would ask the same questions I was asking. Fresh Atlantic, product of Chile. I thought Chile was on the Pacific. It was raised in San Antonio? Okay. So the point is, then I go into, okay, what are the boundaries of the ocean? Isn't it really just one ocean? So I expand a little bit without going on and on about how do we define boundaries between ecoregions or watersheds or oceans in this case. Another one that I have along those same themes is everyday examples of being critical of data. Some of these are spatial, some of these aren't. Some of you might find these interesting. George Mason University, do a search on there in Google Maps. Simple Chinese fast food chain. Interesting. I thought George Mason was a major research institution. Is there a Panda Express in the food court? I don't know why it says simple Chinese fast food chain there. How about this? Orientation matters. Oops. You probably have other examples of bad maps as well. Favorite food in every state. Hey, Lori, you from South Dakota? Hey, what's your favorite food? I'll put it on my map. So the end value of a lot of these maps based on surveys is extremely low. And I know a lot of them are just clickbait, right? They're meant to generate a reactions for you to click on the site. And some of them are fun, admittedly. And the maps are a key part of that. But again, you have to be critical of these data sets. How about this? I was writing a paper with our chief medical officer, Esri Garrity, about the intersection of COVID, GIS, and geography about a year ago. And I was looking at the location for the National Academy of Sciences. Oops. The result was a house at the end of a cul-de-sac here in Metro Denver. That's not the National Academy. I know it's a pretty big building in suburban Washington, D.C. That is not the National Academy. How about this? This data feed from the Internet of Things was online for a year. I know it gets hot in Texas, but look at this. It's really hot and it's really windy, and the precipitation is like Noah's Ark. I mean, this is major flood. Be critical of the data, even if it is, if you weren't critical, right, your interpolated surface would have this huge spike there. And finally, this isn't spatial, but I thought it was interesting. This isn't a real Beatles album. I've never even heard of some of these songs. Penny Lance is in my ear. Cans Buy Me Love. A Day in the Sky. It's someone's misspelled playlist. Be critical of the data. That is the whole point of this spatial reserves data blog that I hope is helpful going forward. All right, last of the skills, and I know we've got 1 minute left. Know your geospatial and geotechnical foundations. Again, some people in an organization need to know a little bit about GIS. Others need to know a lot about GIS. Again, assess their needs and respond appropriately when they come to you for assistance. Adaptability. Go outside your comfort zone, whether it's regionally, nationally, or at a conference like this one. Go to something that's totally new. You meet some new people, you find out what they're interested in, what drives them forward, what they're concerned about. So be flexible and adaptable. Have good communication. Remember my nudge on the elevator speech earlier. And so in some folks, I think that this decade will be a quite exciting one for geotechnologies. And you all have a key role in achieving that goal. I'm an optimist, and I do believe that wise decisions will be made with the spatial perspective. We've got a great community, you all. We've got some very good data sets. We've got some very good tools. We've got the ability to share. We've got the ability to gather data, analyze it, and it will lead to this healthier, happier, more sustainable future that we're all seeking. Comments, questions? We've got about 30 seconds only for comments and questions, but while you're thinking about that, you can guess where this was. Well, appreciate the opportunity. I know we've got other things. Lori, Curtis, over to you. Samantha?
Hey, Joseph, it's Catherine. I'm going to be moderating today. Is that in the Badlands?
It is the southwesternmost corner of North Dakota.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh. Yep, just due north of you. Yeah, beautiful terrain there.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Joseph. That was great.